and welcome to another Wrestling Roundtable discussion podcast. I'm Adam Wilbourn from WhatCulture, joined by the Dudley boys of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes or Spotify for daily wrestling podcasts, where we review pay-per-views, Raw, SmackDown, we have interviews, we have more roundtable discussions, and we have a round of the week complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. But gents, the question I want you to answer today, centering around all the discussion of Dean Ambrose's future, is what is wrestling's best ever work? But before we start talking about that, I want to know your thoughts on this Dean Ambrose situation. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about him leaving the company when his contract expires in April. WWE released a statement where they didn't use their typical future endeavors line. Is he leaving the company, or is this all a work?
You go first.
He's not going anywhere. It's a work. I don't trust anything in the industry anymore. Like, we've, as like a sort of a community of fans that are fortunate enough to be able to get to talk about it and write about it and report upon it occasionally, we've been given so many stories over the last few years from the industry that is wrestling's attempt to try and deal with this post-kayfabe world. They can no longer like hide the secrets of the industry. Things come out, things are reported every week. So all the time, WWE are trying to like work us as fans to try and find a way to make us invest again. They know that we know that a lot of their superstars are unhappy. Someone like Dean Ambrose is a prime candidate for that, because look at what we've had to watch. Like, us as fans haven't wanted to see Dean Ambrose doing this. So why would Dean Ambrose, the performer, particularly want to be getting involved in those storylines? This just seems yet another perfect storm for WWE to be able to promote something as actually really happening. Then sure enough, when we think he's out the door after WrestleMania, he wins his match, surprises us all, and sticks around for another 6 months, or re-signs like CM Punk did, or whatever. It's just like last year it was Nikki Bella and John Cena. Everything always feels like a work until it's categorically proven to not be. They were splitting up and then they were back together again because it made sense to pop a rating on Total Bellas before they finally split. Call it my general mistrust of these stories until he turns up as John Moxley on Tuesday Night Dynamite or something like that. I'll reserve judgment.
Right. What compelling evidence that you've seen on WWE television in the past like couple of years compels you to think that WWE is capable of pulling off such a vast conspiracy like this that just literally turned Rusev heel 48 hours after the guy he was feuding with engineered a situation in which his wife's ankle got shattered?
You were giving me the evidence.
And he just forgive her.
You were giving me the evidence because the left hand never knows what the right hand is doing.
I'm not giving you a note. Honestly, they're not capable of something like this. Like, literally everyone's been worked. Like, was it, who brought the story? Was it Killam? Mike Killam?
Yeah.
Like, an unimpeachable reputation. Dave Meltzer is more or less, he hasn't corroborated it, but he said that he firmly believes it's a shoot situation. In order for this to have happened, for WWE to have presented this as a work, they've buried their creative by saying one of the top stars is so fed up with it that he's willing to leave.
And there's precedents for burying creative before as well.
I know they've just literally done it with Baron Corbin.
Yeah.
But this is just too much.
It was the message. It was honestly.
And why
we came into work.
It was the statement, wasn't it?
We came into work and I was fully on board with it. I was like, wow, that's a shock, but I'm not surprised. And I think we all kind of reacted with that. Oh, good for him. Good for him. And now you see that statement at the end of the day, and I'm like, nah, fixes in. Like, the way that they jumped on top of it in a very different way to how they would normally, which is to say not at all until he's actually out the door, and then it's the future endeavours message. That felt entirely different. And to me, that was them wanting to create the story. Like, not wanting to create the story, but wanting to create the story in a different way. Like, you've got Meltzer and the news sources. All they ever pick up on is rumours and what they're told from their fairly reliable sources. So who's to say that this source wasn't given that information reliably before WWE could leak it in the way they wanted to leak it?
Okay, another question before we get going with the actual works, right? Why would they go to these lengths to put Dean Ambrose over? And that's not a slight on Dean Ambrose himself, but like the creative they've been given him is like terrible, because absolutely abysmal.
Because I don't believe this is a Dean Ambrose problem. I think we've witnessed how aware they are of people's understanding of AEW's recent impact. This arms race to sign talents who otherwise probably wouldn't get jobs. On the weekend that Jeff Jarrett and Shane Helms get jobs as producers, which is not to say they won't do great work, but it's probably as much as anything Jeremy Borash telling Triple H, get these guys hired before they go elsewhere because they'll provide value. We're reading stories that like several wrestlers are feeling disillusioned within WWE and are aware that there's suddenly a brand new option out there, this is a way for them to finally capitalize on that, other than just Twitter footage of guys getting the t-shirts taken off them. If they can create this illusion of dissent backstage with a character perfectly placed for it, like Dean Ambrose, we saw Chronicle. We know he's a man that kind of exists on the fringes of that company as it is. They could look at him and think, right, how can we deal with this character that we've miscast as a comedy psychopath?
You're hearing yourself.
Yeah, but look, after WrestleMania, like, I'll come on this podcast and like lose my own pasty bet to this sort of thing, as it were, and say, yeah, all right, I was wrong, he's gone. But I just feel like there's enough times where you have been worked by this sort of real news, as it were, getting out. There is no real news in wrestling until something has actually happened.
Can I ask you one more question before we get into the meat of this, right? You're Dean Ambrose in this situation, right? You have been told, you know what, to get heel heat, you're going to have to bury one of your best mates for getting leukemia. You're going to have to tell each and every city you go to, while wearing a gas mask, that they smell. And you're going to have to wrestle this match that, with you as the heel in the dynamic, fans have been clamouring for ages. It's a wild blood feud brawl manifesting at the end of this storyline. It's going to be a normal wrestling match that's going to get booed out the building and put into the death slot. Would you want to stay with the company?
If given this proposition and the works we're going to talk about today were all devised quite, complexly to generate discussion on all the guys, if he's in a position where he's going to have the discussion, which we're having now, generated about him, what was going to be the discussion about him otherwise? Nothing. 3 days before WrestleMania, we were going to say, are you looking forward to Dean Ambrose versus EC3? Not very much. Like, all of a sudden, he's been a huge talking point. If this is something, and there are precedents for it, as we will go into, for somebody to be reheated through a situation like this, then I'm more likely to say yes to that after having said yes to what I've just said yes to the past 2 or 3 months. I think those terrible storylines are probably driving his motivation to want something better, especially while the industry is kind of so exciting again with opportunities for wrestlers.
I'm inclined to agree with Hamflet here, but I think regardless, I've said this on multiple occasions already, regardless whether or not this is a work, it's beneficial for Dean Ambrose. If he stays, then hopefully they'll give him something good, and this is a launch pad for some legitimately decent heel work. And if he leaves, he's been given this announcement that he's leaving to get all the other companies excited, and there'll be a bidding war because lots of people want to see him. But anyway, let's move on. We want to talk about some of wrestling's best ever works.
The real ones. Real ones.
And we should start off with a fairly obvious one in relation to this, and that, of course, is CM Punk's pipe bomb. At the time, how did you feel about it, and subsequently looking back, what are your opinions on it?
This was, to its ultimate detriment, business-wise, the sort of thing that just completely inspired me to believe in the product. The problem being is that I hate it, like, every time you say these words, you come across as a complete idiot or a complete bellend. But like, I've just preferred the inside of the wrestling industry for like several years now. I am, and I hate the word itself, but in many ways, I'm like a Smarky fan. Like, I'm obsessed with the intrigue and the backstage fascination. I like technical wrestlers more than the Big Show and Kane, all the rest of it. In many ways, I'm the worst kind of pro wrestling fan. Let's face it. This angle and the incendiary, brilliant promo that served as the catalyst to it was directly aimed at me. I bought it hook, line, and sinker, but I wasn't the fan that ultimately was going to change CM Punk's true headline career, which arguably never happened.
It's funny, yeah, the promo, you make a great point there, because I remember that promo so fondly in the way that it was as if he'd wrote out a list of things he had to check off that would bore directly into my soul as an internet experienced wrestling fan, as that exact
who sort of sick of Cena and all the rest of it.
He found every single hot point, things like mentioning Colt Cabana by name, or referencing John Laurinaitis or Triple H and Stephanie McMahon as family members and the next in line
Luke
to
Gallows.
the throne. Yeah, everything he said, the mention of New Japan and Ring of Honor, all these are very now we can
Heyman wasn't Heyman then as well.
No, yeah, charming almost. Little things that we were aware of, a band list, and he was right, I'm going to tick off that, I'm going to tick off that.
Just even the word wrestling, I'm the best wrestler in this company.
It was so perfectly engineered to capture all of us, and I think that many of us spoke about it, that was why it kind of bled over into the mainstream, and all of a sudden CM Punk's been interviewed by GQ, and Money in the Bank 2011 is what it is as a pay-per-view, and sure enough he signs a new contract. So if it wasn't a work at that moment, Vince McMahon's best part of his involvement in the work was giving Punk the autonomy for 15 minutes at the end of an edition of Raw. That was a really clever, calculated risk by a guy that obviously still had it in him to get the best out of his talent. Because over the course of that, 2-3 weeks that was left, Punk did it again and again. There's the segments with John Cena and Vince McMahon, so brilliant and yet underrated because they're left in the shadow of the pipe bomb. But everything that was happening on television around that time, it was utterly, utterly gripping. Every word that was spoken mattered more than it had mattered in years because of the stuff that he'd basically allowed. It was like releasing a load of ghosts back onto the onto the product that was suddenly like sort of speaking around, and everybody like it was like nothing was off limits all over again during a time when it was so micromanaged. And I think that was the value of that. By then it was, becoming a work. That was the real value of it, was just like allowing the shoot to breathe on one week, suddenly give the wrestlers new things to work about.
You look back, this is one of my first things that obviously popped into my head. You look back on that time, and yes, looking back, they really botched the Summer of Punk. And yet, throughout that, there was still an element to me that felt confident that they were going to pull this round. And that was only instilled because of this. I thought if they can come up with something as good as this pipe bomb promo, and like you said, 2 weeks after that, he brings out a megaphone saying, I bought back up this week and what have you. Even though they had Money in the Bank and then they brought him back, 8 days later. And even though you had him, teaming up with Triple H and losing and Kevin Nash and all that, it instilled such faith in me that no, they're gonna. This is all part of a bigger plan. It wasn't, but it was, like you say, it re-established an adoration for the product that I'd been missing for a long time. Michael Sidgwick, what's some of your favourite works in wrestling?
Right, we're going to get the American stuff imminently, but I want to talk about a work engineered by All Japan Pro Wrestling in 1994 because it hits all my buttons. It is one of the most realistic things to have ever happened that was framed as really happening when in fact it was a work. And there's also an undertone of cruelty to it all. So in the 1994 Champions Carnival, an American wrestler by the name of Doug Furnas dropped the legend and by that point company ace, Mitsuru Misawa, with a suplex that he sold as if, like, I'm really injured here. And to give you some context, most Japanese wrestlers, especially tragically Misawa, if they were hurt, they would never tell you. They would battle through the worst injuries to preserve their aura as gladiators. It's just part of the culture and the mentality over there. So for this to be sold as I'm missing the rest of the tournament was major. So major that you would never, ever doubt that it was a lie. But the genius twist is that it was a lie. Doug Furnas in the aftermath was completely bollocked by everybody, even the ones who were in on it. And it was kept very, very far away from those who were not. Stan Hansen gave him a massive, massive taken off backstage. And the end result of all this was that Doug Furnas felt awful. He felt awful. Word got out to Misawa that Doug Furnas felt horrific about this whole development. And Misawa called Furnas into the locker room and he made a gesture to everyone else in there to get out. And Doug Furnas at this point is thinking, my heart can't take getting bollocked off Misawa himself. I've just completely almost ruined his career, and he's the biggest star in Japanese wrestling, or one of them at this point. Misawa, when everybody else is out the room, takes off the neck brace and just goes like that. It says that, like, as if a silent gesture to say, I'm fine, it's a work, go with it, but don't tell anybody because it's a work and we need to maintain all of it. And so the purpose this served was that Misawa was the champion, the Triple Crown champion, going into this tournament, which he was booked to lose, but they didn't want to weaken him to set up a future match. So by going to these lengths to take him out, Toshiaki Kawada ended up winning the tournament. And then to follow up, it's very elaborate, so let me gather my thoughts for a second. Misawa then lost the title to Steve Williams, but because his neck had been injured, he went in to the match having suffered the injury, so it protected him completely. Then Kawada beat Williams for the Triple Crown title that he'd beaten Misawa for, thus setting up a Kawada versus Misawa match. And all the while, Doug Furnas was sat there thinking, I've been screwed over here, because he told Stan Hansen in confidence, look, the whole thing's at work, and Stan Hansen just went, no, Don't lie to make yourself feel better about this. So, cruel, but completely effective, and it built towards something unlike the CM Punk thing, which built towards possibly the worst few months in WWE history.
I think that's interesting as well, because we talk about these works and some of them are very elaborate and very special as a fan, but when it doesn't provide a business-related payoff and it doesn't sort of...
It rarely does as well, you know.
Yeah, this is the thing. If they don't often generate revenue or generate something, a common metric with which we judge great pro wrestling by, the Summer of Punk being probably the prime example. The one I could go with, basically a substantially less sophisticated version of Michael Sidgwick's, which is...
It'd be Dave Meltzer's, but that's what we all do.
Which is John Cena just saying, I'm not going to be back till October. And WWE saying, all right, let's go with that, knowing full well that he could be rehabbed by January to create one of the greatest pops, which we discussed the other week. The Madison Square Garden accidental pop, all those mutants in there that had followed like all the New York scene, like a crowd that would just despise a John Cena that for a second were reduced to like Hulkamaniacs of the modern era cheering for him. You don't get that unless you've been worked so believably that, you know, Vince McMahon got the pop he wanted and John Cena won the Royal Rumble. Mine is also, because me and Sidgwick are a similar age and hold things from the mid-90s in such high value, is one that was so important for the growth of ECW, and a guy that was incredible at the work shoot was Paul Heyman. In 1994, he had a problem with Tommy Dreamer, a guy who he believed was the babyface that ECW desperately needed, but not one that he could get particularly over with that crowd. He would later do that, as you'll be able to find in various ECW documentary DVDs, where he took a caning, the likes of which nobody had ever seen, this level of abuse that he just braved to the Sandman. The storyline that triggered that match, that story that got Tommy Dreamer finally over as a babyface, was one in which the Sandman, who would famously come to the ring, cigarette in mouth, can in hand, a cane flew backwards and knocked the cigarette into the Sandman's eye. So ECW was this promotion that prided itself on bloodthirsty reality within matches, but all of a sudden Paul Heyman had this such deft touch on making that, what you've just seen, so much more real than everything else you've watched all night. Sandman felt the ground clutching his eye. Joey Styles called it brilliantly on commentary. Tommy Dreamer, as he was particularly good at, looked like this, suddenly like overcome with remorse. What have I done? No matter what we do to each other in the ECW arena, this is different. I've blinded you. How did Paul Heyman and the Sandman get this one across to theoretically the smartest wrestling fans in the country? They made the Sandman stay in his house for months on end with a bandage over his eye. If anyone ever came to the door, it was his wife that answered it. If he was ever seen in public, it was with a bandage over his eye. To the point where Sandman's retirement was booked for the ECW arena, and people in that crowd, again, the most bloodthirsty wrestling crowd in America, were in tears. They were watching a man. They sent the Sandman out there in a suit to retire,
Wow.
to say farewell to this crowd. A career that admittedly was pretty daft, but he was beloved there. He was a cult hero there. A career taken too soon. Tommy Dreamer is out there. Woman, the Sandman's manager at the time, is already just disowning him to the hatred of the crowd. How dare she turn on a guy who's lost his sight for this industry, who lost his sight fighting her battles. Tommy Dreamer, the guy that's done the damage, is saying to a woman, how can you do this? How can you do this? And from behind Tommy Dreamer, the Sandman rips away the bandage and just leathers him with the cane. This Dreamer is a figure of hate in the ECW arena. The Sandman, they're just, the wave of relief that washes over the ECW arena that he's fine is suddenly replaced by total and utter shock. They're seeing Dreamer getting beat down, and that is the first point at which Paul Heyman has finally created sympathy for this pretty boy babyface who would effectively become like the man that literally wore the company on his chest every time he came out. How do you finally create a babyface in a world designed for heels? That's how you do it. You've got to make it feel real.
I think the point that needs a little bit more illustration, that was really well done, really well put, is the fact that this audience was the smartest.
Yep.
And they loved to tell everyone how smart they were, and they were just rendered literally dumbfounded by this whole angle. It was superbly done.
The sign guy of the ECW arena was a guy that would take signs with what were effectively spoilers because he knew insider terms when few people did. So he was there literally signposting storylines just to show how clever he was, and jaws were on the floor. You know, yeah.
One other work that I really wanted to mention is slightly more old school than what we've been talking about. That's Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler. This is one of those things you have to look back on. Obviously, we weren't around at the time, but you know, watching. I mean, my first awareness of it was watching Man on the Moon, the Jim Carrey, Andy Kaufman story. You then also see it followed up on the documentary that was on Netflix about it. To summarize this. Basically, Andy Kaufman and Joe Lawler got their heads together, didn't they, and explained that through a chat show, they were going to develop a feud that they were both in on, but it felt not just for the wrestling community, but for everybody that this was a real thing, that Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler hated each other's guts, that Andy Kaufman was wrestling women and this got to Jerry Lawler. And yeah, it's arguably one of the biggest works because this wasn't just the wrestling community. This is the general public of America who watch this chat show and suddenly think, Jesus, this has suddenly got really out of hand. They're fighting on a chat show.
It does make you yearn for a simpler time in that regard, doesn't it? Because this sort of thing could never, ever happen now. It's a lost art, the idea that anyone would believe either an actor or a wrestler, for that matter, could pull off something like this and it'd be legitimate. It would be on Twitter and immediately, like, thousands of people would pick apart how what you've watched is definitely staged. They were given the advantage of, like, probably word of mouth more than people that saw it on television. Like, what have we heard here? A wrestler is beating up a celebrity. I thought the wrestling wasn't real. Well, it can't be, because look what he's done. He's in a neck brace. That was enough. That was all people needed. But what I really like about this work is how the work of Andy Kaufman in particular travelled through to Jim Carrey, like, performing as Andy Kaufman. If you watch that fabulous Netflix documentary, which is basically all about Jim Carrey embodying everything about Andy Kaufman, Jerry Lawler hits Jim Carrey playing Andy Kaufman for real. The work of that work managed to work Jerry Lawler 20 years after the real thing had happened. Like, Jim Carrey had found a way to tap into this incredible actor's soul and become the man himself. And Jerry Lawler, once who was there behind the scenes with his arm around Andy going, "We got him," is suddenly being gotten to. That's quite remarkable. That puts you in the mindset of somebody like Kaufman to be able to devise this whole thing in the first place for the betterment of everybody.
One other thing we need to mention here, and I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about this, is Vince Russo and Hulk Hogan bash at the beach. We have to mention it. It's a very obvious work.
But it wasn't.
In a different realm. It's what I'm talking about. It's in a different realm to the other things that we've mentioned here, and I feel like we should mention it.
This is going to be quite hard because it was a work that was a worked shoot that ultimately resulted in it being a shoot because someone had worked themselves into a shoot.
Actually sounds like Hulk Hogan's tweet.
Yeah, it's the Hulk Hogan's tweet of a pro wrestling angle, and it's rooted in so much truth that it became a shoot, but it was a worked shoot. Jesus Christ. Bash at the Beach 2000. What's happened here is that to try and get Hulk Hogan, like, the title wrapped off him because he didn't want to do a traditional job to Jeff Jarrett, who many actual headliners didn't consider a headliner. And so he said, right, okay, let's just do some bollocks. I'll lay down for him in the middle of that ring and you can cut one of your stupid shoe promos, Russo, and I'll get out, and then theoretically we could work to a return match or something.
Yeah.
So that happens. And Hogan says this is why the company is in the state it's in is because of bullshit like this. He lays down, 3 count, they sell the shock. A lot of people at this point is totally bemused because they've seen so much of it before.
Hogan leaves with the belt backstage.
To sell
it.
Like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's just it's wall-to-wall paranoia. You could always, even know how effectively these sort of things were played out, it didn't matter because there was always the sense that because Russo had driven this trope into the ground, something's up. Like, something's up. You cannot possibly take something like this at face value. Something stinks because everything at this point that Vince Russo was associated with stunk to high heaven. Something stinks here. Something stinks. So the show goes on, I think, and then Vince Russo comes back out later in the show to explain the situation. And again, even though the whole thing was intended as a work, the only way they arrived at the work was because the shoot tension, like, actually existed. Mm-hmm. And getting this whole situation, like,
so hard to pass.
I know, like, getting this.
I feel like people are playing a drinking game at home. Every time I say the word work or shoot, you have to drink.
But in order to engineer the situation, which was like sort of a last resort because discussions about how to, like, deal with the title picture and Hogan's creative control clause and how to get Jeff Jarrett looking not like a moron out of all of this, things were tense, things were legit shoot tense. So Vince Russo cut in this explanatory promo, which was theoretically designed to build towards a match that never did end up happening. He worked himself into a shoot on the back of the work shoot and basically verbally incinerated Hulk Hogan with some very, very cutting remarks that Hulk Hogan obviously didn't like because he was done. afterwards. He called. I can't repeat this.
It was defamatory. It was
Defamatory,
literally
defamatory remarks that I cannot actually repeat on a podcast that we don't want to be demonetized, quite frankly. But used the word shit a lot. He called him bald, and he said that as long as that piece of doesn't come back, like he said, what was it? I'll be dead in the goddamn grave if you ever see that piece of in the company ever again. And he never actually was, even though the intention was for him to come back.
It's the only time he followed through on anything he'd ever said.
Exactly. Ultimately, this whole thing ended up in court. And can you imagine being the jury in this situation? Like, what am I doing with my life? Why are these three deluded fantasists wasting my time? Isn't this meant to be fake? Is it real? And then imagine asking that question, and then the response is, well, actually, this is fake, but they're designing it to be real. But the reality drove so close to home that it became real once more.
It was Vince Russo's misunderstanding of how to use the work shoot. I think when he got to WCW with the reins off completely. So with pro wrestling, I think we all speak as fans of it enough that if you're trying to look through the window of pro wrestling and there's a big blind up, you want to peek through the blinds and just kind of get a few of the secrets for yourself. Under Vince McMahon, Vince Russo was given permission to write those storylines and book those storylines in which he knew that there was fans just like us that wanted those little extra peaks that we can't always get. In WCW, it was like somebody pulling a sunblind right up, whoosh, straight up. He believed that you just wanted a clear view straight in. There was pay-per-views in which Kevin Nash would build up by saying, "Oh, I'm going over." And that doesn't work in professional wrestling. You can't do that. And he leaves and in the end, Goldberg, who won't do the job, goes out, and the commentators are saying, "Thanks, Scott Steiner, for doing the right thing." Pro wrestling's mask slips in that moment because you have to believe what you're watching at that very moment is real. Vince Russo used to love playing that game where it's like, well, everything is fake apart from this right now. And he just completely misunderstood how to make any money in the way that he'd done with work shoots, less than a year earlier?
Vince Russo is a gift for the content producer, because especially the writers, because you could just use the word backwards is a metaphor and a conceit for everything he did. You can do the little sentences at the end where you go, Swerve, actually, that sentence was wrong. And he just got absolutely everything backwards with this angle. It was absolutely phenomenal. My favourite thing about Vince Russo, my favourite way in which to bury him, is that he targeted this WCW product. He was brought in to compete with the runaway WWF, which was a massive, massive hit with the casual audience. And his big tactic was to target his WCW product to the informed smarks who, when they looked at this book and just thought, I know what you're doing here and I know it's terrible, so what on earth he was trying to do, I've got no idea. He now has a podcast entitled Castrating the Marks, in which he buries people left, right and centre for taking wrestling far too seriously. And it's like, this is the audience that you geared your product to, and that failed miserably. So I wonder what possibly could be your motivation for titling your show Castrating the Marks. I hate you, Vince Russo. I hate that I feel anything towards you.
And that's a shoot.
That is indeed. Let's wrap
It's a
up.
work. It's just for the content. It's just for the sake of the content.
Let's wrap up by very quickly mentioning another thing we were discussing before we came here, which is Brian Pillman, one of the classic works as well, against Kevin Sullivan. Explain what we're talking about.
It just feels like we should have got to this sooner, because you could do 50 podcasts on
This
Brian
start
Pillman's.
of the trend.
Yeah.
This start of the trend. We should have done it. We Russo'd this because I did this at the end and it should have been at the front.
Brian Pillman's
Thought I'd cheer you up with this at the end. I knew that was going to take it out of you.
His first 6 months of 1996, he surveyed the wrestling industry and he saw how it was changing. He saw how money was being made, and he realised he was on the outskirts and he wanted to be one of the big earners. And he orchestrated a manner in which he could get himself out of his WCW contract for real, and then use ECW to up his value to either WWF or WCW re-signing him. It was utterly, utterly incredible. So the work
Genius, groundbreaking, like unprecedented.
The work shoot here is that he's in a storyline feud with Kevin Sullivan, which is a nudge and a wink to the people that know otherwise that there's been tensions between Pillman and the booker, Kevin Sullivan. He says, I respect you, booker man. The fans' jaws drop yet again because they think they've seen and heard something that shouldn't have happened. Pillman storms backstage, sells a row with Eric Bischoff to the entire locker room to, again, work the industry, because they know that people are going to Dave Meltzer with this. Pillman himself was a friend of Dave Meltzer, but there were other people backstage going to Dave Meltzer or going to Wade Keller or whoever the guys at the time saying, oh, it's really blown up between Bischoff and Pillman. Pillman, and again, this is a long story too short, and there's a wonderful book out there, I think by the name of Liam O'Rourke. I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, but it's really worth a read that goes into fabulous detail on this. But Pillman convinces Eric Bischoff, the, at the time, brilliant millionaire sort of president of WCW, whatever he was, executive vice president, you need to release me for real. Otherwise, the guys that we're trying to fool are just going to know that this is a work. So you're going to have to release me for real. Gets his release, goes to ECW, comes in as this all-conquering babyface, because as we discussed, these are the smartest fans in the room as far as they're concerned, and then threatens to whip his you-know-what out and piss
Johnson.
all over the...
Johnson, he says...
Johnson, didn't he?
He could have said cock.
And piss all over the ring because of how much disdain he had for these people that supposedly knew all about...
He calls them smart marks as well.
Yeah, that was it. He was dropping like all these insider terms. It was perfect. It was the exact right use of him. Tragically, as there is contracts on the table from WWF and WCW, he gets into a horrific car crash. He's living very, very fast with his life at the time. It is, it's on their record. There's nothing, he's sadly passed away from these exact demons, but he was going through a lot at the time. There was a chemical imbalance there, but it helped drive this crazy mind. Unfortunately, he had a terrible car accident, got himself very injured, and yet the companies still wanted him. Not knowing what he could still physically offer to the product, he'd created that much of a buzz and whipped up that much of a frenzy around him that he was the most in-demand guy. He got himself a guaranteed deal from Vince McMahon when those sort of things were never being offered. WCW still wanted him. He was still on the phone to Eric Bischoff before he died. He was still in good in contact with him because he was considered that valuable, because he'd shown that it wasn't just about your body, it was about your mind. Wrestlers were inspired by him. It was such an incredible thing to watch happen. And, I was a fan at the time trying to piece it together myself through magazines and probably very primitive internet, maybe not even that. But it was just excitement because he was able to get such visibility across all three promotions. He was reminding you that the wrestling universe was coming together in ways that you hadn't seen before. And this only predated something like the New World Order by 6 months. And the NWO was basically effectively telling you, that's Razor and Diesel from the WWF. So he was ahead of those machinations in the industry happening, and he was getting it all for himself. The one little thing about Pillman that I wish had happened that never did was that he wanted to chain himself to the goalpost during the Super Bowl. That transcends pro wrestling. If he's the guy that runs naked onto the pitch at the Super Bowl and just handcuffs himself to it, then he becomes a story that we're still talking about for entirely different reasons today. Had he got away with that one? Well, for a start, I think Vince McMahon would have signed him on the day. I think that would have been exactly Vince's cup of tea before the car crash and before everything else. But I would have just loved if that would have been an extra part of that story, because I think in terms of mainstream, he would have broke through in a way that really was only ever in the wrestling bubble.
It truly is infamous, this.
Yeah, one of the reasons why this is such a profoundly brilliant work, and I think sometimes the abbreviated narrative kind of sells short the performance, but because it was unprecedented, because we'd never seen it before, because we'd never had more reason to believe it, because it was the first time he'd seen the trick, his performance throughout was so good. I mean, you talked about his excess. He lived his life pretty much exclusively. It was midnight every hour of the day. This is a man who looked like he'd never blinked in 5 years. His eyes were so white. His voice was so hoarse. He looked like he never slept. The only thing he did was just live an excessive lifestyle to the full hilt, crazy, 24/7. His performance was absolutely genius, and one of the more tragic components of it, and I hesitate to use that word because obviously the man died very young, leaving behind a family, kids who he adored, is the fact that he was an actual sensational worker as well.
Yeah.
He wasn't just a clever guy who had to create this scheme to hide his limitations as a worker, that he had to do something else because he had that and then some in the bag. He was a great, great worker who also, in a similar vein to Steve Austin, realised the change of the times and kind of evolved his in-ring work. He was flying Brian Pillman, and then yet he evolved into this fierce brawler. He knew exactly what was happening before literally anybody else did, and he changed the industry, but he could have done even more.
One last little thing on Pillman, if I may. In January, which is right around the time of that, WCW were in the process of building up to infamously one of the worst matches of all time, which is Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage versus 8 heels in the Doomsday Cage.
What? One of the worst?
One of the worst.
No, one of the best, mate.
Hogan was watching this and immediately was on the phone to Bischoff saying, I want Pillman in that match. And you know why he wanted Pillman in that match? Is because he wanted to drop the big leg. Pillman, who had fought through every injury. That voice was part of a throat cancer operation, and like he'd worked with like ankles half hanging off before, managed to get a doctor's note to get out of that Doomsday Cage match because he was switched on to everything, switched on to absolutely everything, knew what could damage him, knew what could attack him. When he signed for WWE and he wasn't injured enough, it was Shawn Michaels, the WWF champion, a guy again who was like very politically charged as Hogan was. Pillman was top of his list. That was a feud that Vince McMahon saw money in, assuming Pillman could get fit, and how tragic that he never did. Again, it's hard to talk about tragedy when a man died and lost his family, but there are many micro tragedies to this story. And a fit Brian Pillman in '96 versus Shawn Michaels
Can you imagine,
for the WWF
man?
title is why Vince McMahon is offering that contract.
That seems a perfect place to end for today. So let us know your thoughts on what you think wrestling's best ever work was in the comment section or on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. Whilst there, you can follow all three of us. You can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
You can follow Michael Sidgwick at
Sidgwick.
You can follow me at Adam Wilbourn. As I said, you can follow us all at WhatCultureWWE. Make sure you subscribe to What Culture Wrestling on either iTunes or Spotify for more daily podcasts. My thanks to the Dudley Boys. Thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.